My name is Emily Kelly. Today is June 13th, and I'm interviewing LindaPalmberg at the Newkirk Public Library. So we're going to start off with what motivated you to join the military?
Okay, I come from a very patriotic family. My father was in World War II. He was in the European theater of war, and he helped liberate at least one of the concentration camps. He was with the 82nd Airborne. He was not present for D-Day. He stayed in England at that time because he was recuperating from being in Italy. He met my mother in England. And so my mother was in what the British called the Women's Land Army. The women that were able would go out and work on the farms because the men had gone to war. So my dad was Army. My mom came to the States to marry my dad, and then she had to go through the classes to become a citizen. And at that point, I was probably 2 years old, but we were never allowed to disrespect the flag. We were expected to be good citizens. And in 1969, the Vietnam War was in full force, and where I couldn't go to Vietnam because I was a woman, I could go in the military so that one of the men could go if they needed to. And I didn't have a marketable skill when I left high school. I didn't have anything I could go and do as a job. And so I researched it, and they told me that the Air Force was the best one to go into because they had the easiest plan as far as when you got finished with basic training and stuff. So I went in the Air Force on the 13th of June in 1969. And basic training at Lackland Air Force Base, Texas, which was the only place you went if you were in the Air Force, was rather hot. And we had flags that they would fly, a red flag, a yellow flag, and a green flag. If there was a green flag out, all activities were done. If the yellow flag was out, you did it in moderation. If the red flag was out, you didn't march, you moseyed. And so I made it through basic training and went to what we called Tech Training School, which I was sent to Biloxi, Mississippi. Oh, wait a minute. Do you want me to keep going? Okay. I went to Biloxi, Mississippi, which was Keesler Air Force Base, and I got there just before Hurricane Camille came in. So Hurricane Camille came in, and I didn't start my training as a clerk typist until after the base got back to normal. And while right after Hurricane Camille came in and hit, all the men, starting the next day, all the men would be marched off the base to go look for survivors or those that didn't survive. And we women were not allowed off the base for like 5 weeks because they didn't want us to see anything that would be traumatic. And I should say that in basic training, we never learned how to shoot a gun. We never saw a gun except on somebody else. We never had practice with guns or anything. We were not expected to shoot guns. We were expected to be ladies. They taught us how to put on makeup. They didn't tell us how to they didn't teach us how to fire a gun. But when I finished Tech Training School in Mississippi, I went to the northernmost part of Maine, to Loring Air Force Base, Maine. And to get there, you had to fly into Boston, and then you flew out of Boston to Presque Isle, Maine. In the summertime, there were 2 flights from Boston to Presque Isle. In the wintertime, there was 1. And if you couldn't make that flight for whatever reason, whether it was the weather or you didn't get there on time, you had to stay in Boston. So we always had to be prepared to stay in Boston. But I don't have my list, so I don't know where I'm supposed to be on this.
Did you ever wish that you could be like on the other side of it and get to be the ones to learn how to shoot the guns?
Nope.
Never?
Nope. Never. Until about 4 years ago, I had never shot a gun with ammunition in it. BB guns, but nothing else. I didn't grow up. I grew up in a city. I mean a city. I don't mean a small place like Newkirk. I grew up in Aurora, Illinois. It was big enough and everything that there was no way. And when I got married, my husband I never showed any inclination, and he never taught me.
So, what was your primary job after training?
I was a clerk typist. In Maine, I worked in the orderly room, which I was the one that you had to come to if you needed a pass to go off base. And I had to get somebody's permission, but then I was the one that typed up the passes. When people came in, I had to make sure that all of their paperwork was correct. If they didn't have enough of a clearance, then I had to ask for the clearance from someone else, and they had to be researched and get their clearance. I worked on the flight line because the building I worked in was the 42nd Organizational Maintenance Squadron, and they worked on the airplanes, and so our office was on the flight line. When I left Loring, I transferred to McConnell Air Force Base, and I worked in the Form 5 section, which when you see guys flying, the military flying, every few minutes that is recorded and kept track of. And I worked on a key punch machine. And yeah, you'll have to ask somebody. I worked on a key punch machine, and I had the IBM labels, and we had a card for each of the guys that flew, and we would make multiple cards and store them. And then when we got the paperwork that said they flew, then we would draw cards for each of the guys, and we would stick them in the key punch machine, and I would have to put down how many hours, and whether it was a long flight, a short flight, or if it was just takeoff and landings, because the pilots got credit for every time they landed and took off again. And that was what I did at McConnell Air Force Base in Wichita.
Where did you serve the majority of your time in service?
Loring Air Force Base, Maine. I went there I had to report on the 2nd of December in 1969. The snow was probably already 2 foot deep. And we didn't see the grass until March maybe, April, May. It was still snowing in March and April. We were clear up there. You went north, you went to Canada. You went east, you went to Canada. You went west, you went to Canada. To stay in the States, you had to go south.
What rank are you most proud of to earn, and why?
Well, my highest rank was a staff sergeant, which would have been, I believe, an E5. And I attained that while I was at McConnell Air Force Base in Wichita.
Which medals or citations are you most honored to have received, and why?
I didn't receive any medals other than the one that everybody gets when they finish basic training, because I didn't go anywhere or do anything that would require a medal. Since I was at Camille, I got a letter of appreciation from the guys that I worked with. Since we couldn't go off base, we had to do the stuff on the base. And one of the things we did was we worked at the mess hall. And because Hurricane Camille had been pretty well devastated, that part of we didn't have electricity. They had generators, but they only used the generators for the important stuff, the hospital. The mess halls had generators for their important stuff, but they didn't have air conditioning. This was July or August of 1969, Mississippi, hot, humid, sweaty. We worked at the mess hall, and one of the interesting things was, one of the questions that was asked was food. Well, the food was always delicious in the Air Force. We had the best food. Anybody else, my husband included, if they had the opportunity, they would eat at an Air Force mess hall because it was better food than what they got in the Army. We had a better selection. But after the hurricane hit, we weren't allowed to have milk because all the milk went to the children. And all the children, dependents of military people, came into the mess hall to eat, and they got the milk. We drank chlorinated Kool-Aid. Yeah. They couldn't use the water because the water wasn't pure enough, so they had to chlorinate it somehow, and then they put Kool-Aid in it to make it taste better, but no. And that was back before bottled water, so you couldn't go buy a bottle of water or a gallon of water. That wasn't heard of. And one of the things I did after Hurricane Camille was I worked at, I don't know if they really tell me what it was called, the Hurricane Relief Center. And what I did was Air Force bases all over the country were sending supplies to Keesler for the people that were at Keesler, for the dependents, because you couldn't buy stuff. There wasn't stuff in the grocery stores because everything had been hit so bad. And so we had a lot of canned goods and boxed goods, like crackers and stuff. But the building I worked in was like a, I don't know, kind of like a grocery store, but it wasn't. But there were shelving, and I would get these boxes and go through and put green beans with green beans and corn with corn and canned milk with canned milk and that kind of thing. And they had diapers, and they had formula and anything you can imagine that you might need after a hurricane. And when the people would come in to get the stuff, they would determine by what their family makeup was what they were allowed to have, and then we would box up the stuff for them, and they would get it. They got it for free. They didn't have to pay for anything, but it was kind of fun to put stuff up on the shelves. It's a precursor to my last job. But anyway, what's another question?
Do you have any people that you had like good relationships with that you make to talk to?
Well, I met my husband while I was in the military. He was in the Army, and at the time the Army didn't have an air traffic control school. And so they sent all the guys that needed to go through air traffic control school to Keesler Air Force Base in Mississippi to get their training. And when I shipped in, I was a newbie, and I was just minding my own business, and this girl walked up to me and asked me if I wanted to go to some church services. And I thought, well, I don't know, maybe. And I said, what kind? And she told me what kind they were. And I said, sure, because if we went to church services, we could stay out after curfew. We had curfew. But you could stay out after curfew if you went to church services. So she said her boyfriend was going to come, and we would all go together. And so her boyfriend came, and I took one look at him, and my heart went zip, 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 and I couldn't believe it. And all these years later, we are still together. But we had a group of, I call them kids because we were 17, well, we were 18, 19, 20, 21, whatever, but we were young people, and we would go to this one lady's house, and she would take us to church. I was a Baptist. Randy was a Methodist. That particular character was a Jew. That one was an Episcopalian. There was another Baptist, and we just had all, but we went to a Baptist church, and we loved to go to the Baptist church because they had dinner on the grounds every Sunday. And there is nothing that hollers louder to military people than home cooking. And so we would go to this one lady's house, and they made sure we all got to church, and we'd sit through church, and then we'd have dinner on the grounds. And we enjoyed our dinner on the grounds. But I met my husband while I was at Keesler Air Force Base in Mississippi. And he went to Korea, his girlfriend went to the Philippines, my boyfriend went to Alaska, I went to Maine. I just, it wasn't supposed to be. But Randy and I wrote letters, and he wrote some really long letters because they would put him up on a mountain, and he had time. And I had time because what do you do in Maine in the middle of winter with 3 foot of snow on the ground? I mean, one time I was supposed to go to the base dental clinic, and I went out the back door because it was closer to the clinic, and I had snow clear up to my thighs, and I'm not a short person. And I waded through the snow, and I got there, and the guys that are the dental hygienists and stuff, they got there because they had a snowmobile, but the dentist wasn't there. He hadn't made it yet, so we had to wait for him before I could have anything done.
Do you have any funny stories you want to share?
How about the time I went to California by accident?
What?
That's another story. We got married in December of 1971, and I was stationed, like I said, in the northernmost part of Maine. And because we were so isolated with the snow and everything, they had what they called incentive flights. And if a KC-135, which was the tanker that refueled bombers and the other jets, if it was going somewhere and back and wasn't going to do a refueling mission, they could take people on board and take us places. Well, this particular one was supposed to go to McConnell Air Force Base in Wichita, which my husband at that time was attending Wichita State University. And after it landed at McConnell and dropped me off, it was supposed to go on to California. Well, it was February. It was just before Valentine's Day. And we took off from Maine, and I had my bicycle and everything that I didn't need that I was going to leave in Kansas so that I didn't have to ship it. And we got to Wichita, and the airplane was experiencing some kind of problems, and they said if they landed at Wichita, they wouldn't be able to take off and get to California, which is where they had to be. So I had to go to California. Didn't know anybody in California. But there was a master sergeant on board that plane who was going to California to see his family. And he had given me a ride once or twice to work because we lived about 2 miles from where I worked, and I would walk every day. And we're talking the northernmost part of Maine. It gets cold up there. So once in a while he would give me a ride if he saw me walking. And so he offered to take me to his house with his family. And we got off the airplane, and I went with him and his family. They were all there. And he had a wife and kids. And we went to a restaurant in February in California. And I looked at the edge of the parking lot and I said, green grass. I couldn't believe there was green grass in February. I grew up near Chicago. You don't have green grass in February in Chicago either. But they just laughed at me because it was so funny. But I got to travel around Fresno. And because we were stationed in Maine and we took the opportunity to go swimming as soon as it wasn't frozen, we would go swimming if it was less than 70 degrees outside. And the reservoir that we went swimming in was a lot less than 70 degrees. But we went anyway because we were young and we were fit and we could do it. We were in California and we were running around in our shirt sleeves because it was warm for us. And people were running around. It was 72 degrees and they had winter coats on. I couldn't believe it. And we actually, one couple, it was their honeymoon type thing, and they were staying at a motel, and so they invited me, and we all went swimming in the motel pool. We were the only ones in the motel pool. It was an outdoor pool, and we were the only ones in there. Felt real comfortable to us. So I'm trying to think. There was another one I thought of when I was telling that story. I don't remember what it was.
What was the most demanding part about your deployment?
Well, since I wasn't deployed overseas, the biggest problem was the snow and the ice. While I was stationed in Maine, I actually broke my leg in February of 1970, I think. And I had a full leg cast until May, because that was, back in the day, you kept them on for 3 months. And I was trying to navigate in ice and snow with crutches. I had to use the crutches because the walking cast wasn't enough. It was too, but the snow was interesting. We'd have a snowstorm, and they would plow the street, and they made sure the flight lines were all completely cleared off, and then they would take us, when they plowed the street, they had this one that blew it up onto the side. And then they would take another snow blower and they would go down and chew that all up and throw it another length away. So all of the poles on the Air Force Base were a good distance away from the curb so that the snow plows could get up on there and chew that stuff up and send it. And the reason they did that was so that the next time it snowed, they had somewhere to put the snow. And the snow. I can remember one time going to work, and we had 2 ways we could go. The straight way went to the control tower and then over to where we worked. And the other way kind of cut off and went around this way. Well, the way that cut off and went around that way was completely snowed in. They issued round, before they became popular, round fluorescent balls to put on your antenna on your car, so that if your car got buried, you'd have that extra piece sticking up. And then when they cleaned out that area, they would go as close as they could to a car and then shovel it out, move it, and go to the next one. One of them was a little tiny sports car that was caught. All you could see was the antenna with a little ball on top.
How does your military experience affect your life today?
Well, since I met my husband while I was in the military, it's been prolonged. But we understand each other because we were both military. When it came time for my son to graduate from high school, he decided he was going in the military, and he went in the Army. So we have 3 generations now, my dad, myself, and our son, that have gone into the military. And it affects me today because I'm still very patriotic. I still believe that when you see a flag go past, you're supposed to stand, cover your heart, and wait for it to pass before you sit down. There's just certain things that you just do because they're ingrained. I still say ma'am and sir because my mother instilled that in us when we were children. And then the military, well, you didn't dare not say that when you were in the military. So that's kind of where we're at there.